I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1794 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. This episode is brought to you by the Legacy Staffs, which are crafted by the Brazos Walking Stick Company out in beautiful Waco, Texas. You can go to brazosticks.com and use my name, Mac Payne, at the checkout section and get a whopping 10% off your next order of the Legacy Staff or cane of your own design. That's right. They don't have stock staffs and sticks out there at Brazos Walking Stick Company. Every staff and stick they sell is custom designed for the customer. That means you can go out there and pick a color, pick a shape, pick a design, put your name on it, put your branch insignia on it, or whatever. It will be made exclusively for you. I have one of these Legacy Staffs, and I can tell you, it is substantial, and if you get one, it'll be one of your most prized possessions, I guarantee. With that in mind, let's move on to the content of this podcast episode. In the previous two episodes, I talked about some strategic concepts in our world today, and that is the amazing closeness between Vietnam and the United States. One would think that two countries that fought such a vicious war many years ago would have a hard time getting together. Not only are the two countries getting together, but they are becoming very, very close in today's world. It's happening because of the old concept of an enemy of my enemy is my friend. Vietnam right now is not real friendly with China. China is attempting to be the bully on the block, just like they've done ever since 44 A.D., when they beheaded the Trung sisters, who were heroic Vietnamese patriots who tried to kick the Chinese out. You see what happens when you try to do that. Many times you have your head taken off. In this episode today, I'm going to take a look at one of the soldiers who participated in the war that made the current friendship between the United States and Vietnam such a noteworthy event. Mike Jones is a Vietnam veteran who was born and raised in Kewanee, Illinois. Kewanee, Illinois is one of those bedrock towns in the great heartland of America. It sits about midway between Peoria, Illinois, and Davenport, Iowa. I'm going to feature a story about Mike Jones that appeared in the local paper up there, the Star Courier. Title of it was Coming and Going to Vietnam. Talks about Mike being drafted, and then something very interesting that happened to him on his flight over to Vietnam, and then what happened to him when he came home. It's a good story because it highlights another tremendous representative of the great Vietnam veteran generation, one as great as any that ever heeded the call of duty from its country. Mike Jones was drafted back in 1970. He didn't turn tail and run off to Canada like some of those other yellow bellies did. He answered the call and went over to Vietnam, did his best over there, used a skill that he had picked up from his father, welding. Turned out to be a valuable skill over there because he could do all sorts of things with armoring vehicles and helping keep his fellow soldiers in the 1st to the 50th Infantry safe. He did a good job over in Vietnam. He came back home to Kewanee and spent a lifetime there, probably welding and contributing greatly to his community. I don't know Mike Jones personally. I know what he went through over there in Vietnam, And I know when he came home, he was older, wiser, stronger, and better able to deal with adversities than his non-Vietnam veteran contemporaries. The story I'm going to share with you was provided by Dave Clarke, who is a writer for the Star Courier. Dave did a very good job of describing what Mike Jones went through in his Vietnam experience. Again, the title of it is Coming and Going to Vietnam. Let's take a look at what Dave Clarke wrote about Vietnam veteran Mike Jones. Dateline, Kewanee, Illinois. Mike Jones found himself in the jungles of Vietnam in the summer of 1970. 50 years ago, he was listening to his favorite rock groups, the Beatles and the Dave Clarke Five on WLS, and watching Wild Wild West and Gunsmoke on TV. He had been employed as a welder, a skill taught to him by his father at the Kewanee Boiler Company since graduating from Kewanee High School in 1967. On September the 13th, 1969, his 20th birthday, he was drafted into the Army and started off on a path that would lead him to Vietnam, one of the bloodiest and most controversial wars. Maybe so, if you discount the Civil War and World War II and maybe the Korean War. Most all our wars are bloody. Continuing. 2 weeks later, they started the lottery, and my number was 312, which was high enough that I probably would not have had to go to Vietnam, Jones says today. Being drafted, however, would turn out to briefly make Jones one of the brief stars of a new TV news magazine called 60 Minutes. On May the 26th, 1970, which was only a month before yours truly went over to Vietnam in June of 1970, Jones and 200 other inductees boarded a plane at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago and flew to Oakland, California, where they were to get on another plane bound for Vietnam. We noticed a camera crew outside of the plane but didn't think anything of it, said Jones. Then 60 Minutes correspondent Mike Wallace himself walked onto the plane. Members of the TV crew lined up a group of young men in the aisle and asked 15 of them if they would mind being interviewed for TV. Private Jones said he would and was one of those chosen. Wallace's assistants picked Mike, they said, because he was a nice red-headed American boy. Then they were introduced to Mike Wallace himself, a correspondent on 60 Minutes, which had only been on the air since September of 1968. Jones had seen Wallace on TV, watching the show, which initially aired on Tuesday nights with his parents, Clarence and Irene, in their home on East 10th Street, right there in Kewanee, Illinois. He called me Jones, probably because that was all that was sewn on my uniform. Mike remembers. Wallace asked him what he was thinking about. Can you imagine that? Is that all he could come up with? Speaking to an Army guy who was on a plane on his way to Vietnam? Is that the best Mike Wallace could come up with, asking a soldier on his way to Vietnam on the very plane that was flying him over there? What are you thinking about? And just think, Mike Wallace got paid big money to ask such questions. Continuing. Jones's answer to that question was home, and whether or not he would get back safely. Are you worried about Vietnam? Wallace asked, to which Jones replied, yes, but probably no more than anyone else on this plane. That was another one of those questions you wonder why somebody who is paid as much as Mike Wallace would ask. Looks like he'd have gotten deeper into the subject, which he probably did. Continuing, 9 young men from Kewanee had been killed in Vietnam since 1967. Jones said that after the Q&A, Wallace sat in the seat next to him, but slept for about 5 hours during the rest of the 21-hour flight, which included stops in Alaska and Japan. Jones appeared 3 times in the 15-minute segment, boarding the plane, sitting next to Wallace, and being interviewed by the correspondent. He was pretty cool, Jones remembered. Very cordial to everyone. Most of those correspondents over there in Vietnam were pretty cool. I myself had the unique opportunity to speak with none other than Jed Duvall, who was one of Walter Cronkite's ace #1 assistants when I was up there at Quezon. He was very nice and very informed about the Vietnam situation. He explained to me the whole history of the war, and it really opened my eyes to what was going on. Unfortunately, even though Jed Duvall appeared very friendly to us there at Quezon, what he wrote about us in the papers was not very nice at all. One of these days, I'd like to run into him if he's still around and talk to him about it some more. Jed Duvall, if you're still out there, please get in touch with me. I'd like to speak with you about something. Continuing with the story. The CBS News crew told those who were interviewed that they may possibly be on the segment to air Tuesday, June the 16th, and to write home and tell their families, which Jones did as soon as he landed. He wrote to his mother about his encounter and described Wallace just as common as an old shoe. The segment titled Coming and Going to Vietnam was introduced on the program as follows. In 1970, 5 years after the troop buildup in Vietnam began, American servicemen were still being drafted and shipped to war at the rate of about 12 plane loads a week. At the time, the entire country was gnarled in a great debate over the war and whether the sacrifice of these young men was worth the fight. So Mike Wallace boarded a commercial Super DC-8 chartered by the military and bound for Bien Hoa Airport near what was then called Saigon to ask the freshly drafted soldiers what they thought of this war they were told to fight. After they arrived, Wallace boarded a plane back to the U.S. with a group of war-weary troops who just finished their year-long tour in Vietnam. The result is a fascinating documentary-style look at the soldiers' state of mind in 1970 America. He didn't mention it here, but I'm sure all those guys on the return trip were hard to talk to because they were probably yelling all the way back with screams of joy that they made it through a year in Vietnam and they were going home. Continuing with the story. Jones said after seeing a tape of the segment later, Wallace practiced more of the tough questioning approach for which both he and 60 Minutes became well known on the returning soldiers' flight, asking them questions more critical of the war and if they thought it was worth fighting for. Today, when asked how he felt about the war, Jones said that before he went, like a lot of guys, I was brainwashed to believe it was something we had to do to beat communism. Afterward, it was a waste of time and good people. In all, 11 young men from Kewanee were killed in Vietnam, including Charles Mitchell, a young man Jones knew at Kewanee High School who was killed in November of 1969. Jones was assigned to the 1st Battalion, 50th Mech Infantry. Drawing on his experience at Kewanee Boiler, Jones said, I was supposed to be a welder, but wasn't. He was assigned to an APC unit out of Nha Trang at LZ Betty. Hometown skills did win him an Army Commendation Medal, however. Some welding needed to be done to keep a Caterpillar bulldozer moving so the jungle could be cleared, and for 2 weeks he welded essential equipment, including the installation of steel panels on the sides of 2.5-ton trucks used to transport men and materials. He spent 11 months of his 21-month Army hitch in Vietnam, and the closest he came to being wounded was when the base camp was under mortar attack. One of his highlights of his time in Vietnam was seeing Bob Hope's Christmas show with none other than Ursula Andress, Johnny Bench, and Lola Falana. He was lucky. I missed the Bob Hope show when he came to Camp Eagle, headquarters of the 101st Airborne Division. Unfortunately, I missed the show because I was flying a mission, supporting our guys out in the Ashaw Valley. On my way back to Phu Bai, I decided to swing by Camp Eagle because I had heard that Bob Hope was there. As I flew over it, I could see the big show going on with hundreds and hundreds of troops in attendance. At first I thought about how cool it would be to do a low-level pass right over the stage, right when Ursula Andress was doing her thing. But then my better judgment took hold because I knew somebody would get my tail number and I would be in even more trouble than I already was. I seem to have trouble with authority, especially over there in Vietnam. I did make it home safely, but missed the Bob Hope show at Camp Eagle. Returning to Mike Jones' story. His return flight on United Airlines was diverted from Oakland, the original stateside destination, to Fort Lewis, Washington, because returning soldiers were being harassed and objects thrown at them by war protesters. Mustered out with the rank of Spec 4, he flew from Fort Lewis, Washington to Chicago, Illinois, and was told to change out of his uniform and into civilian clothes when he landed to avoid being the target of protesters. But Jones said there were only a few protesters at O'Hare and no one bothered him in his civvies. Met by his mom and dad, Mike was asked by his father what he wanted to do. I said, I wanted to go to Sandy's and get a high-low burger, Jones said. I was sick and tired of C rations and Army food. I know exactly how Mike Jones felt when he got home, and I'll bet that a high-low burger at Sandy's was delicious, because I'm sure his mother and father took him by on the way home to get one. That is the story of Vietnam veteran Mike Jones from Kewanee, Illinois. He was drafted into the Army, served in Vietnam, came home and continued serving his country, more than likely as a welder in Kewanee, Illinois, there at the Kewanee Boiler Company. People like Mike Jones is what makes this country great. Mike Jones, I hereby issue you unofficial Vietnam Veteran News Podcast salute for your service to your country, both in Vietnam and back home in Kewanee, Illinois. We thank you very much, and we wish you the best. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1794 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for coming to listen to these stories. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?